All right, hello everybody. Want to see if we can make this a little bit bigger here. All right, then we'll hit the presentation. There we go. All right, so last time we talked about Reagan. Um, Reagan, he cut taxes. He believed in traditional values. He was personally popular because of the way he handled things after he got shot. He won the Cold War. The Cold War's coming to an end towards the end of his time in office. So, not awfully popular president. Kind of a hard act to follow, tough act to follow. So, his vice president ran George H.W. Bush in 1988. Bush just died 2018, very recently. But he ran in 1988 against Michael Dukakis. All right, and as far as presidential candidates go, Bush may be the best qualified ever candidate for run for president. He'd been Reagan's vice president, very successful, 8 years. He'd been the leader of the head of the CIA, that's our spying agency. He'd been the ambassador to the UN. He was a World War II hero. He got shot down as a fighter pilot fighting against Japanese. Barely made it out alive. He got shot down into the ocean, and he got rescued there in the ocean. But he was a war hero. And he did, learn how to fly planes when he was about y'all's age, just a little bit older than y'all. When he's running for president, his biggest promise is he's going to be like Reagan and not raise taxes. Reagan, one of the sources of Reagan's support was that he cut taxes. So at the Republican convention in the summer of 1988, he says something like, they'll come to me, Congress will come to me and they'll want new taxes. I'll say no. Then they'll come to me again and they'll say, we need new taxes to pay for this, and I'll say no. Then they'll come to me a third time, and I'll say to them, read my lips, no new taxes. And everybody kind of went nuts when he said it. Big applause line. But he's kind of trying to tie himself to the Reagan legacy, to the Reagan presidency from the 1980s. All right, well, he's running against a fellow named Michael Dukakis. Dukakis had been the Democratic governor of Massachusetts. During the campaign, the Bush campaign called Dukakis a liberal, which back then was just kind of seen as a bad thing. You weren't supposed, liberals were associated with the 60s and the 70s and the hippies and Vietnam and protests and so forth. This is after 8 years of a very popular Republican, a conservative Republican. So liberal was kind of an insult, it's kind of a bad word. The Bush ran an ad against Dukakis saying that when he'd been governor of Massachusetts, he let this guy Willie Horton out of prison on what's called a furlough. It's like you get a weekend off from prison, and Horton went and attacked some people. I think he killed somebody. So at the time, being soft on crime, remember crime's real high in the 1980s. And crime and race kind of closely related. You kind of had some tough times in rap music and the Crips and the Bloods in the 1980s. And so this wasn't a racist ad, but it kind of appealed to racial fears by saying he's soft on crime, and then showing the picture of the criminal that he had let out of jail, saying he's kind of soft on African-American crime. So that hurt Dukakis. So during the summertime, Dukakis was up on Bush in the polls, but this liberal label starts to stick. The ads they run about Willie Horton hurt Dukakis. At the first debate, Dukakis was asked about the death penalty, and the moderator asked Dukakis, who was famous for having a good marriage. His wife's named Kitty Dukakis, and they loved each other. He loved her a lot. They were real close, and so the moderator said, if Kitty Dukakis was raped and murdered, would you be in favor of the death penalty for the killer? And he said, well, no, I wouldn't. As you know, I'm against the death penalty. Then he changed the subject. So it was just kind of a bloodless, kind of unemotional answer. And so it made him seem like he wasn't a very passionate person, like he wasn't a real man. And so that hurt him. And then he wants to come across like a tough guy, that he'll be tough like the Cold War. So he does this kind of photo opportunity. Presidential candidates do that. They'll have pictures of themselves taken, at a factory or something, associated with voters they want to win in an election. So Dukakis said we were spending too much money on nuclear weapons under Reagan and not enough money on tanks, not enough money on other kind of weapons. So he has himself photographed riding around a tank, and he looks like the old Snoopy cartoons. He just kind of looked silly. And so the Bush campaign read an ad saying, is this guy going to be our commander-in-chief? We can't afford that risk. All right, so those things hurt Dukakis in the campaign, and so Bush was able to beat Dukakis in 1988. All right, now when he becomes president, one of the first things he says is he kind of runs saying, hey, I'm like Reagan. But once he becomes president, he wants to say, well, in some ways I'm different from Reagan. And he said America under Bush was going to be a kinder, gentler nation. You had a lot of poverty. You had social problems that were kind of getting worse in the 80s. Inequality was getting worse, kind of like in the Gilded Age. From the 30s to the 70s, inequality had improved. But in the 80s, it started getting worse again. So Bush says, these social problems I'm going to try to address. The AIDS epidemic hit the gay community just really, really hard in the 1980s. And Reagan was seen as kind of harsh towards people with AIDS. Homelessness became really just a big problem in the 1980s, for the first time since maybe the Depression. And so Bush wants to be somebody who's going to be more compassionate towards folks who are struggling in the 80s economy. One thing he does is he gets Congress to pass something called the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which creates ramps for any new construction project. That's why there's ramps at Calhoun High School. Any new building, there's codes requiring that ramps to be built in addition to steps. And that's because of Bush. Okay, so there's the first one. Let me pause for a second. Answer those questions. So you'll write down 7 facts, and then you'll answer the questions. I may try to get you a film about Bush. I think he's kind of a neat and kind of forgotten president, so it's kind of interesting, especially since we've got a little bit of time here. Okay, he was really good at foreign policy. In the area of foreign policy, he was a very successful president. And I'm going to say this again at the end of the lecture, but a lot of historians call him the greatest ever first one-term president. So most one-term presidents who don't get reelected are not seen as really good presidents. But he's got a lot of respect, kind of a second 10 kind of president. The Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War's ended, and Germans knocked down the Berlin Wall. I was in college when it happened, and it was something that I never thought I would see happen. Communism almost fell in China. You had these protests in this place called Tiananmen Square, and this one guy stops this big line of tanks, and everybody's really it was this inspirational video. There were bad guys in the world at the end of the Cold War, and Bush would send in the military to help people. Serbia was a place where something was going on called ethnic cleansing, and Bush attacked the Serbs and made them stop. You had starvation going on in Somalia, and Bush sent in troops to feed the starving in Somalia. There was a guy named Manuel Noriega who was the leader of Panama, and he'd kind of been our ally during the Cold War. But once the Cold War was over, Bush realized that he was also running cocaine into the United States. So he sent in troops, and they overthrew the president of Panama, and they arrested him. He died, and I don't think he's still alive. I think he died in American prison. All right, so just a lot of foreign policy success. This second one is the big one for him. In 1990, I think it was 1991, 2290. Yeah, it was 1990. It was 1990 when this happened. August 21st, 1990. I think is the exact date. But at any rate, during the 80s, Iraq, the country of Iraq, you see right here, was kind of our ally because it's fighting a war against Iran. And remember, we didn't like Iran from back to the days of the hostages in Jimmy Carter. So those two countries fighting a war, so we generally sided with Iraq and gave them some weapons to fight against Iran. Now, their leader was a mean dictator, guys. There he is right there. His name was Saddam Hussein. And he felt like since we'd helped him against Iran, if he invaded this little bitty country, look, you see how Iraq is almost, to me, it's like shaped like a camel head or something. And then the nose of the camel right there is this little bitty country called Kuwait. All right, and look where Kuwait is located. It's located on this place called the Persian Gulf. And now tell me something over this recording. What do we get from the Middle East here? Well, that's right, we get oil. And how do you think the oil goes from the Middle East to the United States and to Europe where countries need gasoline? Well, it goes on these oil tankers coming out of the Persian Gulf. So Saddam here felt like if he could invade Kuwait, which had a whole lot of oil, and control the Persian Gulf, that he was going to control oil in the Middle East. And he didn't really think we'd care because we'd helped him fight against this much bigger country. What's going to be the big deal if he takes over this little country? All right, well, he invades this place, and Bush sees it like Hitler. He says, we can't be appeasing a dictator. He called him Saddam Hussein. I think he wanted to make his name sound like he was Satan. But for several months, Bush demanded that Saddam pull his troops out of Kuwait. All right, it was this build up to war, and I was in college. And I was scared. You know, I thought there was going to be a big war between the United States and Iraq, and it was going to be like Vietnam. I had a college professor who was saying it's going to be just like Vietnam, and guys going to be coming home in body bags, and asked me, asked the guys in the class, hey, you ready to go over there and have to fight? There's going to be a draft for sure. So I was real nervous about it. Several guys in my dorm went over there and fought. They were members of the ROTC. But, I mean, the professor was wrong. I was wrong. I mean, the war went extremely well. First, we bombed the Iraqis in Kuwait for like a month. And so they're like freaking out and they're shell shocked because every moment they don't know if it's going to be the last. And they couldn't turn around and go back to Iraq because, their own army would have killed them. So they're just dying to surrender. So when we finally invade Kuwait and attack the Iraqis, they come running out with white flags, just dying to surrender to us. And so the war, there's the general from the war. It's kind of a rock star general. It's kind of like Patton or Eisenhower. The guy's name was Norman Schwarzkopf. I think he died of a heart attack not too long after that, but he was really, really popular general. So the war once we actually invaded, it lasted like a weekend, like less than 3 days, less than 5 days. All right, 100-hour war. Less than 100 guys died. So, I mean, just real whoopings, the biggest win in a war, the easiest win in a war the United States has ever had. Like 4,000 guys died in the Spanish-American War. That was called a splendid little war. Maybe 5,000. Less than 100 guys died in this war. Now, Saddam pulled all his army that wasn't captured out of Kuwait back into Iraq, and Bush left them. Bush didn't invade Iraq. And there were critics, including his son, George W. Bush, that felt like he should have gone in there and invaded Iraq itself and overthrow Saddam. And, his answer was we'd get stuck there. And, when his son, trying to kind of outdo his dad, sent troops in Iraq, well, we've kind of been stuck there kind of ever since. All right, but extremely, extremely, extremely successful war for Bush in 1990. It was in February 1991 when we went in and invaded Kuwait. Okay, there's the second one. All right. I don't like my... I need some... Hey, let's add some questions there. I don't think let's see. So a bunch of those questions are from the first one. All right. Now let's put this. Name some foreign policy successes. And then tell about the Gulf War. Now why did that happen? Dang it. Let's try this again. Let's see if we can get an A in there. About the Gulf War. And we'll put up here. All right, and we'll hit presentation. All right, and then we'll go to the next slide once it comes on up. And there we go. All right, last one. So he's going to be a one-termer. Well, why not? Sounds like he's done a real good job. So you're going to look at some troubles he's going to have. He's going to nominate Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Thomas is currently on the Supreme Court. You know, he's been there ever since the Bush years. And Thomas was the second African-American on the Supreme Court. He's very conservative African-American, you know, kind of. Thurgood Marshall had been a very liberal African-American, the first African-American on the Supreme Court. Bush, a Republican, is nominating this conservative. Well, if you get on the Supreme Court, there's these hearings in what's called the Senate Judiciary Committee. And they kind of check your qualifications. They ask you questions about what you would do. It's almost like a job interview if you're on the court. And during these hearings, a lady who used to work for Thomas in Washington came forward and accused him of sexual harassment. It's the first time I'd heard the term sexual harassment. And so the hearings became controversial. His nomination became controversial. He almost didn't get on there. He got on there. He's there, and I don't know who was telling the truth. You know, both of them were very persuasive when I heard them talking about it. But, the nomination process was not as smooth as Bush was hoping it was going to be. Okay, then the economy went bad. Went into recession. Unemployment got up to 7%. You know, it's like 3. It's about twice what it was. About twice what it is now. It's about 3.5% now. No, not as bad an economy as happened under the second Bush, where it gets up to 10 or 11% unemployment, almost half of the unemployment rate of the Great Depression, 25%, and probably it's not as much as unemployment's going to be when all this is over. You know, a lot of folks, losing jobs, and so I would expect the unemployment rate to go up quite a bit in the next few months. But the economy went into recession. People felt like it's because of the deficits. That debt was bad for our economy, that, our budget has been paying off like interest on the debt. So in order to reduce the deficit, Bush broke his no new taxes pledge. So he raised taxes, and so that made his supporters mad, made Republicans mad, because Republicans don't like high taxes. So he's kind of unpopular because the economy's bad, and then his own party's kind of mad at him about raising taxes. Okay, so in 1992, you have 3 guys running. So Clinton's the Democrat. We know the name Clinton. Bush is a Republican, and you have this independent running. He's a Texas billionaire named Ross Perot. It's kind of like Bloomberg this time, but he did better than Bloomberg, and he really, really focused on the deficit. And he got some votes, and most of the folks that voted for Perot were Republicans. So the Republicans kind of splitting the vote. Clinton, I think he got about 43% of the election. His campaign slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." In other words, he didn't need to talk about anything other than the economy. If you talk about foreign policy, well, Bush was a master of foreign policy, had won this big war with no problem. Talked about like culture. Well, Clinton had been a hippie in the 60s. There was already sex scandals around, kind of swirling around Clinton. There was a 60-minute episode where he had to deny that he was having an affair with this other lady, not Monica Lewinsky. So his personal life was pretty controversial. So the only thing he was going to be able to win, if he talked about, was talk about the economy, talk about the recession. So he stayed kind of laser focused on that. And by doing that, he won. He only had about 43% of the vote. There he is talking in one of the debates. All right, so Bush lost, so he's just a one-termer. All right, but I mean, history's kind of been kind to him. If you remember Polk, from the Mexican-American War. Polk only served one term, and he pretty much did everything he said he was going to do. He was going to annex Texas and Oregon. You believed in manifest destiny. But some of the things he did wasn't really that good, just kind of stealing land from Mexico. It was successful, but it was kind of successful at being not necessarily a good thing. Bush was a good president. He had all that success from foreign policy. And as we look back, the historians kind of see it as a responsible thing to do, to raise taxes a little bit to reduce the deficit. But the economy went bad at the wrong time. Perot ran, and so he just lost. But he's the best. He's the only father of a president who got reelected. But he may be our best one-termer ever. All right. So there's the questions. Let me pause a second. I say that took 20 minutes. What do you think? 20 exactly.